Welcome back to the Quran by AI series. We're diving deep today into Chapter 13, the Thunder, or Ar-Ra'd in Arabic. So many big ideas here, like cosmology, the idea of resurrection, and what happens to those who believe and those who don't.
Yeah, and it does all of that while going right at the skeptics and the people who are challenging these ideas. It's not just saying, here are the beliefs. It's responding to the debates and questions people had back then.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Right away in verse 1, we get these mysterious letters, Alif, Lam, Mim, Ra. These pop up a few times in the Quran, and here in Chapter 13, they really set the stage.
It was a bold move, 7th century Arabia, eloquence and knowing language really well. It was a big deal. So to start a chapter with these letters, some scholars say it was like challenging skeptics, almost like saying, you doubt this is from God, you try to make something this beautiful and complex with language.
It's like a challenge, right? And then we go from the abstract to the real world right away. Verses 2 through 4 are so vivid, describing the natural world. Heavens held up without any support we can see, the sun and moon moving in their orbits, the rain that gives life to the earth.
Yeah, but these descriptions aren't just for poetry. It's like signs for people to think about, to really ponder the power and wisdom behind creation. It's so intricate and awe-inspiring. And this was a society tied to nature, so using those everyday things was powerful.
Right. It's like if you're doubting a creator exists, just look around.
Exactly. And then in verse 4, it even mentions farming practices of the time. And that little detail, it actually makes us rethink the idea that the Quran was revealed in this simple farming society.
Yeah.
It's more complex than that. They had specific knowledge, different ways of interacting with nature.
Showing us the Quran was addressing a real society, with all its layers. The chapter then goes for a topic that people were really debating back then, resurrection. Verses 5 through 7 get right into the skepticism around it. Some people couldn't believe we'd be brought back to life after death.
And the Quran's answer, super interesting. Instead of getting into theology, it just points back to the natural world. It's like saying, hey, God created the heavens and the earth, the sun and moon, life and death, bringing the dead back to life, totally within his power.
It's explaining something intangible with something we can see and touch, using the familiar to explain the unfamiliar. What's cool is these verses seem to be responding to debates within monotheistic communities, not just pagan beliefs.
That's key. It shows us how diverse the religious scene was then. This wasn't a one-belief society. Different groups understood monotheism differently. Even within groups, ideas like resurrection had different meanings. So the Quran is having this layered conversation, addressing lots of different thoughts and beliefs.
All these layers of meaning are in the text, and it's up to us to unravel them. So in verses 8 through 17, we see the signs of God's power and knowledge even more.
Verse 8, for example, talks about what's hidden in a mother's womb. God knows it all. It's emphasizing his complete knowledge. And verse 9, God is the knower of the unseen and the seen. You see this throughout the Quran. Nothing is hidden from God, whether it's the secrets in our hearts or the vastness of the universe.
And then there's this incredible image in verse 11. Angels guarding humans from front and behind, following God's command.
Divine protection is a big theme in the Quran. It's comforting, It's saying, even when things are hard, you're not alone in your journey.
It's like having spiritual guardians watching over us.
Exactly. And of course, we can't talk about the thunder without the thunder. Verse 13 describes it as hymning God's praise along with the angels.
So natural events like thunder are part of this universal chorus praising God.
Exactly. Shows how everything is connected and how everything is under God's will and design. But it's not all positive, There are warnings woven in for those who might not accept God's message. And then we get this powerful image in verse 15, everything in the heavens and earth prostrating to God, willingly or unwillingly, even their shadows. It emphasizes how God rules over everything.
It's like a movie, that verse. So visual. Even those who resist God are ultimately under his power.
It really speaks to how God's power and presence can't be escaped. And this leads us into a section where we see the different viewpoints of belief and disbelief.
For example, verse 16 goes right at those who say God has partners, asking them to name them if they really believe in their power.
Of course, it's rhetorical. It's showing how empty idolatry is. Right. Then in verse 17, we get this metaphor with a rushing river. The froth on top that disappears is like falsehood. The valuable metal left behind is like truth. It sticks with you.
Yeah, it's like saying, in the end, truth wins. Falsehood gets washed away.
Exactly. And that metaphor sets us up perfectly for the next section, where we see the different destinies of those who believe and those who don't. Verse 18 really lays it out, the difference between those who listen to God and those who turn away. Like, for those who answer God's call, there's that which is most beautiful waiting for them. But for those who reject him, there's a serious reckoning coming and, well, hell.
It's clear, right? Your choices have consequences. It's not about being forced to believe. It's about seeing the results of choosing one path over another.
Exactly. Then verse 19 asks this really powerful question. It says, is one who know that what's been revealed to you is the truth, like one who is blind. It's aimed at those who reject the Quran, like urging them to really see the truth.
It's like saying you have the knowledge. How can you turn away? Such powerful imagery.
Right. And then, verses 20 to 22, it describes those who truly believe. They keep their promises to God, they honor the bonds he's commanded, they live with awareness of God, and they're patient, seeking his presence.
It's a beautiful picture of what a life of faith means.
Yeah.
It's not just believing. It's about actually living that belief.
You got it. And the reward for that kind of life. Verse 23 calls it the ultimate end, Gardens of Eden. They enter with their righteous families. Angels greet them with peace. It's paradise, eternal bliss and fulfillment.
So hopeful, that image.
Yeah.
Especially next to those warnings about punishment.
Yeah, because in verse 25, we see what happens to those who choose a different way. Those who break God's covenant, break the ties he commanded, and spread corruption. They're promised a curse and a bad place to end up.
This corruption idea is interesting. Like, our actions affect everyone, not just ourselves.
Right on. Everything's connected, and we got to act in ways that bring harmony and justice.
So it's not just about saving yourself. It's about building a just and good society.
That's it. Then verse 26, it talks about something we see all the time today, how temporary worldly pleasure is. It says, they rejoice in the life of this world, but compared to the hereafter, the life of this world is just a short enjoyment.
It makes you think, especially now when everything's about instant gratification and stuff, what really matters, what lasts beyond the fun stuff in this life.
You're getting it. And this leads perfectly into the next verses, talking about remembrance and the peace it brings.
Verse 27, it addresses those who want to see big signs from God. It says, God leads astray whoever he wills, and guides to himself whoever turns back to him in repentance.
People get this one wrong a lot, like God's just randomly picking who's guided and who isn't. But it's deeper than that. It's about our choices.
Yeah.
God gives guidance, but we have to take it to come back to him sincerely.
So we're not just waiting for God's grace, we're part of seeking guidance.
Yes, we're not passive, we have to work for it. And then one of the most beautiful verses in the chapter, verse 28.
The verse about Dhikr, remembering God. Those who believe and whose hearts find peace in the remembrance of God. Truly, it is in the remembrance of God that hearts find peace.
That's the one. It shows how powerful connecting with the divine is. Remembrance isn't just a ritual, it's about being aware, present, turning your heart to God.
That repetition gets me. Truly, it is in the remembrance of God that hearts find peace. It's like a gentle reminder we need in this crazy, distracting world.
Totally. It emphasizes how important this idea is. Real lasting peace comes from our connection to something bigger than us.
It's not about what's happening around us, it's about how we are inside.
You got it. And this inner peace, that's key in Islamic spirituality.
So how do we do dhikr? How does it work in our lives?
Lots of ways. Simple things like silently repeating God's name during the day, or more formal stuff like certain prayers or phrases. It's about always remembering God.
Not just scheduled prayer, but making it part of our lives.
That's right. Imagine you're stuck in traffic, getting mad. Instead of that, turn to God, repeat his name, think about his mercy and patience.
It's like finding strength and peace when things are crazy, we're not really in control, there's something bigger we can turn to.
That's it. Anyone can do dhikr, anywhere. Walking, working, driving, even just waiting. Finding quiet in the chaos, time to pause, breathe, and reconnect.
Finding quiet in the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. We're always getting hit with information that's easy to lose yourself. Dhikr creates peace and clarity inside.
Absolutely. And dhikr's benefits, they go beyond just you feeling good. It affects how you treat others and the world.
So it's not just being good for yourself, it's about making society better.
You got it. Inner peace through dhikr makes you more compassionate, patient, forgiving. You don't react as much. That changes your relationships, helps you build a better world.
It's like, be the change you want to see. You got to start with yourself.
Exactly. And I think that's huge in chapter 13. Just knowing the Quran's truths isn't enough. You got to live them. Let them change you inside out. Make remembrance a real part of your life.
And that message hits even harder when you remember when the Quran was revealed. People were obsessed with money and power.
Right. Back then, this focus on changing inside and growing spiritually, totally radical. It was saying change your priorities. Your relationship with God is most important.
Like that froth and precious metal thing in verse 17. Worldly stuff disappears, but spiritual growth lasts.
Good connection. Real fulfillment doesn't come from stuff. It comes from following God's will, making him happy, and becoming closer to him.
And that's still so important today. We're all about greed, competition, looking good to others. We got to go inward, find what brings real peace.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You know, the Quran acknowledges its connection to earlier scriptures, too.
Right. Like it says in verse 29, for them is happiness and an excellent return. And then in verse 30, it talks about how those communities from before are gone, and what Prophet Muhammad received is part of this ongoing chain of revelation.
Exactly. It's not replacing the old scriptures, it's adding to them, giving a more complete picture of God's will.
What's interesting is how verse 30 mentions that some people who already had scriptures accepted the Quran while others didn't.
Important point. It means the Quran's message wasn't totally new. Some people who knew about divine revelation got it, but others who were stuck in their ways resisted.
Showing how complex religious conversations are. People resist change, even when they see proof. It happens all the time.
All the time. And speaking of history, verse 32 shows us how people have always rejected God's messengers.
Right. It says, messengers were definitely mocked before you. Prophet Muhammad wasn't the first to deal with that.
Makes the prophet more relatable, doesn't it? Shows he faced what other prophets did. Even the chosen ones struggle.
It's comforting. It also reminds us that actions have consequences, even if we don't see them right away.
Exactly. Verses 33 and 34 really drive that home.
Verse 33 asks, is he who is watchful over every soul as to what it earns like any other? Yet they ascribe partners to God. Like, don't underestimate God or try to give his power to someone else.
Right. You'll be judged on what you do and believe, not what others do. Then verse 34 spells out what happens when you put others alongside God.
Punishment now, worse punishment later, and nobody to protect you from God's justice.
Choices matter, both in this life and the next.
But then, amidst all that, there's this beautiful description of paradise in verse 35. A garden with rivers, never-ending food and shade.
So vivid. It's a taste of the reward for those who believe and do good.
It speaks to our deepest desires, peace, abundance, beauty.
Right. Verse 36 gives us a peek into how people who already had scriptures reacted to the Quran.
Yeah. Those to whom we have given the scripture rejoice in what has been revealed to you. So some people from other faiths saw the truth in the Quran and accepted it.
Important, right. It shows Islam wasn't just this isolated thing. It had ties to other faiths. The Quran connected with people who already knew about divine revelation, but not everyone was happy about it.
That some factions among them deny part of it.
Humans, right. Resisting change even when they see the truth.
Shows we all have our biases and ideas about things. Even a message from God gets interpreted differently.
Exactly. And the Quran talks about this resistance in verse 37.
Yeah, it says the Quran was a decisive word in Arabic. It's about the message being clear and powerful, and the fact that it was revealed in the language of the people it was meant for.
The language is key. It's not just what's said, it's making sure people understand it, using their language.
Meeting people where they are,
Exactly. And then it warns those who still reject the Quran, even though the message is clear, if they follow their own desires after knowing this, there's no one to protect them from God. Then verse 38 reminds us that prophets are human.
Right. It says God sent messengers before Muhammad and they had wives and children. It's like saying prophets are normal people too, experiencing family life just like us.
It's for everyone, that message, no matter who you are or what your life is like.
Even prophets aren't superhuman.
Exactly. Then it ends by saying that messengers can only bring signs if God allows it, and for every term there is a decree.
Interesting. Even prophets have to follow God's will and timing.
Absolutely. God's plan happens on his schedule. We may not get it, but there's a purpose to it.
Trust in a wisdom bigger than ours.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving on to verse 39. This is where we're introduced to this idea of Al-Kitab, or the mother of the book. And this is a term that has, can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, right?
You're absolutely right. Al-Kitab has been a topic of much discussion among scholars.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of interpretations. Some interpret it as the fundamental source of all divine revelation, possibly even referring to the preserved tablet where God's complete knowledge is said to be inscribed.
Right. I've also seen it interpreted as just representing God's all-encompassing knowledge itself.
That's another valid interpretation. Both readings point to the existence of this heavenly archetype
Okay.
that precedes and informs all scriptures, including the Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran.
It's like a source.
Exactly, a primordial source.
It raises some profound questions about the relationship between those texts and their ultimate source.
Right, it really gets at the heart of how we understand Revelation and the nature of Scripture itself.
Okay, so moving on then to verse 40. Here, we shift our attention to the prophet's role, and it emphasizes that their sole responsibility is to convey God's message, regardless of how it's received. So it doesn't matter if people accept it or reject it.
It's a powerful reminder that the prophet's duty is simply to deliver the message, not to force acceptance or judge its impact. Their responsibility ends with the act of conveying the divine word.
They're like a postal worker.
In a sense, yes, they're delivering the message.
They're just delivering it.
And the choice to accept or reject, that lies with the people.
And that makes it clear that God is the ultimate judge of humanity.
Absolutely. This verse reinforces the concept of divine accountability.
Okay.
The prophet's role is to warn, to guide, to deliver the truth.
To be a vessel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The consequences of accepting or rejecting that truth, that rests with God.
So now moving on to verse 41. This is where I think the imagery gets really powerful and vivid. It speaks of God reducing the land from its outlying regions. This phrase evokes a sense of sweeping change, even maybe divine judgment. I'm curious to hear how you interpret this.
Yeah, it's a striking image that's led to a variety of interpretations. Some scholars connect it to the historical expansion of early Muslim communities.
Yeah.
They interpret it as a metaphorical depiction of territorial gains, the spread of Islam.
Makes sense, considering the historical context.
Right. But others interpret it more symbolically. They suggest it signifies the spread of God's influence, pushing back against falsehood and ignorance.
Okay, so not necessarily like a physical land, but more like, the land of ideas or the land of hearts and minds.
Exactly.
I've also come across a fascinating spiritual interpretation where the land represents the heart of a believer. And God's reduction is seen as the process of purifying the heart, removing distractions and desires.
That's a beautiful interpretation, and it really speaks to the multifaceted nature of Quranic verses, They can be understood on historical, metaphorical, and spiritual levels.
That's fascinating.
Each layer adding depth to our understanding.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Definitely.
So let's move on to verse 42. This verse dives into the concept of plotting and planning.
Okay.
Stating that all schemes ultimately belong to God. It seems to be saying that, human machinations are ultimately futile in the face of divine will.
Precisely. It highlights this concept of God as the best of plotters, whose plans encompass and supersede any human attempts to, manipulate events.
So it's like saying God is always a few steps ahead.
Exactly.
And we can't really outsmart him.
Right.
It serves as a potent reminder that our efforts should align with God's will, rather than trying to, outmaneuver it. So it's not necessarily saying that we shouldn't plan or anything like that.
Right.
But it's saying that we should acknowledge the limits of our control and place our trust in God's wisdom.
Exactly. Find that balance between striving and surrender, recognizing our agency while acknowledging God's overarching plan.
Okay, so finally, the last verse we'll explore in this section, verse 43, addresses those who deny the prophet's legitimacy.
Right.
And it directly refutes those claims, stating that those possessing knowledge of the book recognize and validate the prophet's authenticity.
It's a bold statement.
Yeah. But it also raises a question. Who are these individuals with such knowledge?
Yeah, there are a few interpretations here. Some believe it refers to those familiar with the Quran itself. Their knowledge of its teachings and their understanding of its profound message are seen as the basis for their recognition of the prophet's authenticity.
But it also seems to go beyond just knowledge of the Quran, right? There's a hint that this knowledge might come from other sources as well.
You're right. Another interpretation suggests that this verse refers to individuals from other Abrahamic faiths who, through their own study and understanding of their scriptures, were able to recognize the prophet Muhammad as a continuation of the prophetic tradition.
Interesting. So in a sense, they're saying that people from other faiths who study their scriptures and they study the Quran will see the connection.
Exactly. Recognizing truth can sometimes come from outside one's own tradition. It suggests that sincere seekers of truth can find common ground and validation across religious boundaries.
Very profound idea.
Right. It reminds us that knowledge and understanding are not limited by religious affiliation or cultural context.
So it's encouraging us to be open-minded.
It is. It's an invitation to be open to insights and wisdom from diverse sources, recognizing that the search for truths is a universal human endeavor that transcends any single belief system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into these verses, I'm just in awe of how deep and complex the Quran's message is. It's been speaking to people for centuries, giving guidance and inspiring people on their own paths, whether they're alone or part of something bigger.
And it's a message that keeps calling us to explore, to keep asking questions, to keep digging deeper into its wisdom that never gets old.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it got you thinking and wanting to explore these verses more on your own. Until next time, keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep diving into that amazing ocean of knowledge, the Quran.